Well, good morning, good evening, everyone. Hope everybody's doing well. We're week number two. Kind of get started off week number one, a kind of foundation into what is sociology, the sociological perspective, sociological imagination, the three main theories: structural functionalism, we just call it functionalism most often, conflict theory, often also known as Marxism, if you're taking this class over in Europe or South America, Central America, probably just call it Marxism. We call it conflict theory, but those two are social conflict theory, Marxism, neo-Marxism, new Marxism, all related. And then symbolic interactionism, oftentimes we just shorten that to interactionism, the study of language, which is a lot of language and identity and perceptions and meaning. That's the symbolic interactionist perspective. And we'll get into that a lot this week as we kind of explore culture all the way from the macro level to the micro level. So that's going to be our journey this week. So I'm going to start off, we're not going to talk a lot about this particular chart, but just kind of wanted to identify, let's kind of enlarge that a little bit. Is it cultural variability, right? Just cultures vary. They vary on certain dimensions. We can look at something like, Protestantism and how a religion, this would be like Max Weber, we haven't talked about him a lot, but Max Weber, a theorist, early 1900s, wrote one of his most well-known pieces of work was the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, that his perspective was that capitalism grew out of or was supported by a shift in religion away from kind of tradition-bound Catholicism to embracing ideas of Calvinism and Protestant sort of ideas and values of the individual, of wealth and accumulation of wealth. Wealth is a symbol of moral worth. Like all these kind of things came out of religion. I just kind of want to indicate with this chart, nothing big, just sort of indicate, man, cultures vary along a lot of different dimensions. There's patterns, though, at the same time. See Nordic countries, Western European countries tend to be more focused on, have a little bit higher levels of secular kind of ideals of science, rationality, more central to thinking about the social world, social policies, looking at things like homelessness or drug policies. In these countries are going to use science to drive decision-making. We come from a more moral position, oftentimes more based on tradition. It gets interesting to be able to sort of pull these things apart a little bit and sort of look at, man, what is the role of religion? It's kind of like thinking about Durkheim a little bit, these external things that are external to us, what Durkheim would call social facts that influence patterns of the human experience. This book here, Martin Hogland, This Life, Secular Faith and Spiritual Freedom, is kind of interesting kind of examination of Nordic countries and this idea of freedom, the value that we cherish a lot, a cultural value, and kind of perspective that Hogland offers is that in Nordic countries, they actually have a greater level of freedom because of the system of supports, the collective nature. So with sort of some ties to the collective and with government supporting, encouraging mutual aid and support and collective sort of spirit, there's actually greater freedom in those places in terms of spiritual freedom to not to be bound. When we're living a more individualistic kind of culture, we're more self-reliant, pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Sometimes, when we have an environment where there's broader social supports, we actually have greater ability to be more free to do different things. Anyway, let's kind of talk about sort of exploring culture, defining it, kind of move down this pathway. So in culture, what we're looking at is language, the beliefs, values, distinctions between right and wrong, what people believe to be true. Traditions are an incredibly important part of understanding culture. The practices, what do people do, traditions, all those particular things, narratives, the stories, the myths within a society itself, that's all culture. Culture is learned. I think it's pretty obvious, right? We don't come out of the womb with a sense of culture, but we get socialized into it and it becomes kind of common sense to us. This is a quote from David Foster Wallace, who wrote the Infinite Jest, as well as other epic sort of writings. And in a commencement speech started off talking about two young fish swimming along, happened to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" Two young fish swim on for a bit. And eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" Yeah, and this is like a story that's been told many times before, but when you're swimming in culture, it's hard to see the novelty, the uniqueness of culture itself. So it's kind of trying to approach things with a beginner's mind, trying to understand the way that we organize ourselves as a society, as a country, as a place. Our values, beliefs, our traditions are based on history, based on power relations between different groups, based on economic factors, but there's all kinds of different things. It's not inevitable or natural, but culture is a place where we immerse ourselves. And sometimes it's important to kind of just be more aware of sort of those cultural things. So from the moment we wake up, this is just kind of an example. We're immersed in culture, and think about the different ways. First 30 minutes, we'll actually kind of go there here in a second. Probably should move that slide. We'll go there right now. But first 30 minutes, think about all the different ways in which we're experiencing culture. Maybe our practices in the morning, just even the bathroom, the architectural design and the technology that's in the bathroom, how that varies around the world, what we drink, what we consume, products. There's, hair and beauty products, coffee we drink. You name it, and we're just immersed in culture. You can look at all kinds of cool stuff around culture, even the way we walk, which is really interesting to break that down a little bit. We mimic, we model to some extent those who are around us when we are growing up and we're developing, even later on in life. And so even how we walk, we carry culture with us in terms of our body position, the way we walk, we carry ourselves. It just seems natural to us, but it's actually being shaped by social forces. I like the idea, like eating ramen, like slurping food, making noise. It's from our viewpoint, from our Western viewpoint, from an American viewpoint, being more silent and eating is something that we honor and value more. Really interesting work, Norbert Elias, who sort of works in this pretty interesting book called The Civilizing Process, the process that went through in Western Europe. And then you could expand this into the United States, starting in the 1500s, 1600s, that started to become this idea of civilization. So things like the way we, ideas and practices, folk ways, etiquette around the dinner table. Don't make noise, keep your hands, don't put your elbows on the table, don't fart, don't burp, like all these different kind of things. It's just kind of interesting how this idea of what you find as etiquette is part of culture. It's learned. If you can kind of look back at over a longer historical time period, it's really amusing to see what was in the past normative, acceptable, and now it's viewed through a little bit different lens. We can look at all the kinds of different aspects of culture too. Think about, this is picture of 1950s, probably middle class kind of white America. This idea of chivalry, holding up the boy, holding the door open for the girl. Black Power movement, the 1960s, spam, where, different cultural variability in terms of whether or not that whets the appetite is part of culture, something that people consume. You're thinking about our skin color, the idea of whiteness around the world, how culture moves around the world and ideas of culture moves around the world. It's an interesting video on how jump rope got its rhythm, and perspective that this person's offering here is that part of actually the roots of hip hop go to skipping rope, part of urban culture, rhythmic, community, all these kind of cool things. We can break down cultures, go back, right? We think about culture, language, values, beliefs, traditions, practices, narratives, stories that we tell. We can also break down culture and thinking about material culture, physical culture, material objects. This cool slide phone from back in the day, even thinking about shoes, bottles, cans here, and the lid of cans. Here's a G.I. Joe action figures. This is actually a hand towel. This is before contemporary ideas of sanitation, but this is commonly found in bathrooms, probably prior to the 1980s. You'd find them in the bathrooms where people would dry their hands and they'd pull it down, and that thing would just circle around. And I don't know how often that was changed. Not fitting our contemporary ideas of sanitation. Wearing wigs, part of material culture. Fallout shelters during World War II, Americans building fallout shelters, part of material culture. And part of the idea of looking at material culture is to understand culture. Like everything has a story. So you look at something like this. This is a old Kodak camera. It tells a story about the materials that were used, the technology that was in terms of manufacturing technologies in this camera. It's a story of time. It's a story of place. It's and we can engage with material culture to help us better understand those kind of things. I think something like straight white teeth, and orthodontia and dentistry is really fascinating kind of area to kind of look at. There's kind of like the health side of, sometimes we have physical problems related to, if our jaw is not aligned appropriately, it can relate to physical challenges. But we have this sort of fascination about straight white teeth, and that's been a value that's been shared across the globe. When I say we, this is coming from the West and coming from America predominantly. And it's powerful, right? That we assign a lot of meaning to straight white teeth. We see that, 80% approximately of Americans have dental insurance, but not everybody has dental insurance. We have some class inequities going on here that have real impacts. The number of people engaging in orthodontia, it's like, becomes more available. There's a story with orthodontia is a pretty cool material culture thing. We'll talk about McDonaldization a little bit, but you can think about, when our kids were a little bit younger and they were going through orthodontia, it's like, wow, it's kind of interesting that it's really been an industry that's been McDonaldized, where it's been just hyper efficient and moving more and more people through orthodontia and less intrusive, new kind of things. So anyway, we could look at the expansion and development of straight white teeth. It'd be interesting if you type in your search engine, look up like white teeth products, look at the images that come up, click on the image icon. And at least on my search engine, based on my search history, but most of the advertisements are for women and also white women. And the appearance would be middle class, upper middle class women, which is really interesting too, like looking at a product and how a product is marketed and sold. There's part status associated with material culture. The objects that we have, not only do they tell a story, but they mark our identity. They mark part of who we are, and they also mark kind of status position. I just put numbers next to these coffees, different coffee companies around Central Oregon. How do we assign status to, or do we? And if we do, what is the status that we assign to different types of coffee, the places that we go? This is kind of interesting. This one here on the left, this was, I can't remember, it was probably at 1950s, 1960s, a lot of restriction in Russia as far as, from the distancing themselves from anything from Western culture. So music, film, banned from Russia. And there was kind of this cool story of these X-rays that some individuals who are serious jazz followers in Russia, where they would make recordings on these X-ray films. This was the material they had. They didn't have LPs. They didn't have the ability to manufacture LPs. So they actually recorded music on these X-rays. And it's like, oh, that's pretty cool. Just story behind, a good example, like how material culture tells a story, in this case about nation and about people and about music, among other things. Ashtrays, they were ubiquitous back in the day before the 1980s, they're in people's homes and restaurants. And, now, that part of material culture is largely kind of faded. Looking at clothing is another good example. The history of American clothing. This is from a company called Goodwear. I'm not promoting them, but just want to let you know this is where this information was coming from. This is the data they're providing between 1990 and 2011, the number of jobs that disappeared because we're outsourcing more or we're importing more and more of our clothing. Throughout most of our history, we actually produced our clothes, and now, that changed starting in the 1900s, and it just escalated in the 1970s, 1980s. We spend $1,800 a year, which is less than we did historically. If we go back in time, 1960, people spent about $4,300, the average household, on clothing. So clothing is cheaper dollar-wise. We consume more. This becomes a little bit of a challenge from a consumption viewpoint and sort of global footprint viewpoint. It's like mass consumption kind of mode. But 1960, 10%, what am I saying here? So today, the average household spending $1,740. Percentage of clothing manufactured in the US continued to drop. The number now is around 2%. Really interesting to just examine that part of material culture. All right, so now we get into non-material culture, values and beliefs and ideas. And I think this is a great example of looking at speeding tickets and ideas of what we see as fairness. Culture is something we're socialized into, like we swim in the water, right? But we don't know, sometimes we're not paying attention, like what's water, right? It's invisible to us. We in the language of sociology, we say sometimes the world is taken for granted. It's so normalized that we take it for granted. And we're unaware of kind of either cultural variability or where these values and ideas come from. And we'll fiercely defend certain values without even thinking really through that value very well. And for me, this is like a great example, this idea like fairness, like how do we define and how do we think about what is fair? We have an idea of fairness that if everybody, for example, if we look at, this is kind of a general example, but looking at K through 12 education, the state allocating the same dollar amount per student, regardless of where that student goes to school, whether that's urban, suburban, or rural community, or the level of socioeconomic status in that community. We did that historically. We did that for a long time. We don't do that as much today. There's part of that, but our idea of fairness tends to be everybody experiences the same. So speeding ticket, same fine for everyone. In Finland, this isn't just in Finland anymore, but Finland, Germany, Switzerland, I believe France, I believe England, more Western European countries are looking at a fine system that's changes based on your income bracket. So if you're speeding 100 miles, if you're going 85 miles an hour and a 55, your speeding ticket will range based on your income bracket. The more you make, the higher you pay. It's same percent, perhaps same percent, and maybe even graduated. I'm not sure, but even if it was the same percent of your overall income, that's kind of how they kind of approach that. See that a fine is meant to be a deterrent, and if you're looking at it from that vantage point, and if one person made $50,000 a year, another person made $100,000 a year, and they got the same fine, it seems like the deterrent value is less for the person who makes less. So that would be very much a challenge for us, right? From an American kind of viewpoint. This is why this Fox News, conservative news network, saying speeding tickets fine based on income is Obama's socialist legacy. That Obama, I'm not sure if he introduced that idea. I'm not sure where that came from. But this would be like, more of an American kind of response. We'd see that as being unfair, which is fascinating, right? Like, why do we see something as being fair or unfair? There's not necessarily one right way. There's different ways, but how do we get so committed to something without even really thinking about what that might be? I don't know, a couple of different things. This is just kind of a real brief example. We were traveling, my son and I were traveling to Idaho one time. We went to gas station late at night, and there was somebody working there, and I was like, hey man, what, we were waiting for a while, no one came up, and it's like, man, what's going on? And it dawned on me after a few minutes that, oh yeah, you have to pay, you pump yourself here, you don't have somebody to be there's no gas attendant there to fuel you up. Cultural variability, right? Greetings are interesting. Are an interesting aspect of looking at culture. Okay, so let's kind of talk about the prompts for theme number 1. So in your own words, you can use some of the language, in terms of the defining qualities of culture, but define it. I start off, that this idea about culture, it's around us, from the minute we wake up. What are some things that we Americans in general, what do we encounter the first 30 minutes of the day? So this is a material culture challenge. So I gave you different examples. Identify some item of material culture that you believe gets at something unique or interesting or strange about culture, present, past, some time period. Discuss what the item is and how it illustrates culture and material culture. If you can, include an image of the item itself. And then non-material culture, this one would be a little bit more difficult perhaps, but define it, explain it, and then provide an example where you see it in the grocery store. So that may be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm confident that you can get there. Take your best guess. All right, so theme number 2, we get into like this idea of ideal culture versus practice culture. The definition is pretty straightforward, but there's a little bit of stuff to unpack around kind of the idea. So ideal culture is like our aspirational culture, what we want things to be, what we hope things to be, what we, what we believe things, the best of all, what is like the best culture kind of thing. So ideal culture. And then there's the practice culture, the reality. So myth versus reality, fact versus fiction, a little bit. But it's like, I think about it as like what we aspire, our aspirational goals, or what we view as the ideal culture, and then the real culture. Well, a couple things to think about. So that's like how we define it. So one thing to try to get at is what's the distance between the ideal culture and the practice culture? So if you look at something like individuals who have disabilities, we have the ideal culture in terms of open access, support, resources. And then we can look at the practice culture. What's the distinction between the two? There's been a lot of discussion over the years about equality versus equity, right? So equality is, like equal, everybody gets the same box regardless of the size of who they are. This is more equitable to see the game, look over the fence, different resources for different individuals. And then finally, well, why don't you just remove the boxes so everybody can see the game? And the reason I bring this up is like this idea of ideal culture, the way we want things to be where everybody has an opportunity to participate. Everybody is treated sort of equally, the sort of democratic values and ideals. But then we have practice culture, the reality. And so if we look at the distance between the two, what is it that we aspire to? What is it we profess? And then what's the reality? We can look at the distance between them. And then I think then if we could acknowledge that, the goal is then we're in a much better position to get closer to that ideal culture. So my ideal culture gets us into mythologies, narratives, stories that we tell. Practice culture is looking at reality, right? And so we're trying to understand the distance between the two, and in some way, sometimes what's preventing us from doing a better job of examining the practice culture or moving closer to the ideal culture. This is like looking at income over since 1970s. We look at the gap between the different percentiles, the top 90%, the bottom 10%. If you look at overall the income levels, the bottom 20% has moved. It's adjusted for inflation, but we think about things like the cost of living and some things like college education, it's gone up significantly. So the impact, even though it's gone up a little bit, it's really difficult for the bottom 10% to be able to fully engage and have the opportunities to be able to engage in dominant culture and institutions kind of thing. And then we look at growth and development, right? That over the top of the top 90%. So ideal culture, what is that balance between the top and the bottom? What is the story we tell? What is the story we tell about how people get to the top or where people are in the social class kind of realm? So what's the narrative? What's the story? Then what's the reality? Look at things, a couple different examples. Look at voting, the idea of democracy. Women achieved the right to vote or were recognized to have the right to vote in 1920. And, ideal culture, practice culture, idea of democracy. Everybody has a voice. Well, clearly that wasn't the case. We still struggle with that even today. Looking at voting rights, voting disenfranchisement, voting rules and regulations, that there's a body of evidence, at least a perspective, that a lot of that stuff is restricting access for people to vote. There's political implications of that. Native Americans don't gain the right to vote until 1924. You have in the South, African Americans, for all intents and purposes, and we had literacy tests and things like this. The poll tax restricted African Americans their ability to vote until 1963, I think, was the Voting Rights Act. So that President Johnson signed into place. It's like addressing kind of that disconnect between the ideal culture and the practice culture. And we still have kind of struggles with access to voting. So, like this idea of voter suppression is still pretty powerful, and it's been increasingly powerful over the last couple of election cycles, and probably will be. There's just a lot of things that are being contested, but it kind of raises the question: what is the ideal culture and what is the practice culture? We could look at something like we pride ourselves as a nation in terms of family values. This was a language that was really prominent in the 1980s and 1990s. Don't hear it quite as much today, but we look at things like, paid maternity leave around the world. We have in the United States, companies may offer family medical leave, which is different than maternity leave. They don't family medical leave. Have to apply for short-term disability oftentimes in order to get leave during a time period if there's for pregnancy or for family support. Then you look around the world. So what's the ideal? What's the practice? And then I put here the minimum wage and just sort of like look at the minimum wage and what do we imagine to be, what should that wage be for having a decent shot of life, and or to think about, fair compensation for the work that people do. Ideal, I don't know, you could look at body images. It's just another example. I mean, the ideal culture being represented through Barbie, and Barbie's changed over a period of time, recognition of different body sizes and shapes. The ideal in terms of the male body. This is a white, a male body that maybe fits class and race dimensions as well. But the ideal, and then what's the reality in terms of how we are, how we appear. Again, going back, this is water, right? We're immersed in it. So sometimes we don't ask questions about that narrative and the story about culture. We believe that ideal culture and practice culture are closely aligned when they actually may not be. Kurt Anderson, this is kind of interesting, but Kurt Anderson breaks down, like, focus on, why Americans are prone to believing in fantasy land. Like we live in this, we have a hard time getting to that practice culture. And there's a lot of different dimensions to it, we'll kind of go into, but think about it. Think about like the development of, America is like this idea of a beacon on the hill. Anyone can become anyone. Hollywood is a producer of myths and stories about culture, among other things. And we are just have a difficult time sometimes reconciling that ideal versus the practice culture itself. So theme number 2, distinguish between ideal and real. Provide at least 2 reasons why studying the difference between the two is important. And then discuss some of the concerns or problems that may arise if the distance gets too great between the ideal and the practiced. All right, so now theme number 3, we're gonna get into language. And we'll talk a lot more about this in class, but the idea of the Whorfian hypothesis, Benjamin Whorf, who was a student of Edward Sapir, so they're called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. A lot of debate and discussion. I recently kind of read through McWhorter's work here, The Language Hoax, and his claim is that, or his idea is that the Whorf hypothesis is actually false. That language does not structure thought, but the hypothesis that I kind of like, there's the original, this gets a little confusing, but the original hypothesis and then how the hypothesis has changed over time. I think what McWhorter is trying to debate or trying to critique is this idea of a strict Whorfian idea that language structures your thoughts. So if you don't have a word for, if you have a certain word for something, it actually structures the way you see the world. McWhorter sees that that's not actually true. And most people today don't see that language determines how you think, but language shapes how we think. It's also a reflection of culture and values and different ideas. So language, the degree of influence of thought, that's the question. We view the world through a lens of language in part. It's not an on or off switch. There's a lot of research going on into like, how do we establish whether or not language is actually shaping the way that we view the world? I think some other things that to get outside of that debate for me is to look at the relationship between language and culture, that language and culture are interactive. The words that we have to describe the world are a reflection of cultural ideals and cultural ideas. And we'll kind of come up with a lot of different examples of this about language and culture being interactive. You think about the words like cisgender, where a person's gender aligns with their sex assigned at birth. Transgender language, evolving, changing language is shifting when culture is shifting. And so we can, in class, I'll kind of give you a handout list of words. We kind of add to them this idea of like looking at the relationship between language and culture. Etymology, looking at roots of language is really interesting. Disaster is a pretty cool one. French desastre, disastro, Italian ill star, miss, ill, astro, star, planet. Unfavorable position of a planet. The star here is probably meant to be an astrological sense of destiny, fortune, fate. This idea of misfortune and star, like think about disaster. I don't know. I've kind of etymology kind of takes to that place. Think like, it's interesting where that comes from and how we use it versus like the origins of that. So the debate is like Worf had the idea that the Hopi Indians was one community that he studied that he said they don't have a concept of linear time. Time is more not bound by sort of a linear kind of progression, chronological progression. So they don't experience time in the same way. Eskimos and snow is another example. Oftentimes used that Eskimos had like 5 words for snow. Therefore, if they have more words for snow, they actually see snow differently. There's a lot of refuting of that idea. I mean, think about it like physically, it doesn't matter how many words you have for snow, your perception is that you see the snow regardless of how many words. But the more words you have, you may be able to fine tune and start to look for snow in a different way than you did before. That becomes kind of the nuance. Words are ways of describing, seeing the world. They, to different degrees, maybe shape the way that we think. So if we look at somebody who's bilingual, multilingual, one idea is that they have 2 different minds when they're thinking in 2 different languages, or they actually fully integrate both of those languages so that it's not like they think differently. They're just like fully integrated. It's like having one language system, but sometimes they use one versus the other, but it's really one language system. And perhaps there's a third option, something in between the 2. Grammatical gender. So language shapes the way we view things with with a noun. Some various language nouns are gendered, la silla, la mesa, using gendered pronouns. The question is, well, does that shape the way that people view things? El puente is a bridge. Other societies, it's a feminine form. There's been some research of looking at it when it's a masculine, in cultures where it's a masculine form, people tend to describe the bridge as being sturdy and strong. And when it's feminine form, more elegant. This is some of the research that's comes out with that. This is kind of interesting, like Baradiski, if I pronounced her name right, community in Australia she studied, they don't have words for left or right. They use directional, north, south, east, west. And what her investigation research discovered is that actually have the individuals in that culture have a greater sense of geographic place, navigation, because part of the way in which they kind of see the world. If we look at some sociological implications, we can study language to study culture is kind of a key idea. And also potentially to study culture, language, we can actually facilitate social change. So the idea of praxis is the study of something, research to actually generate social change. So think about like linguistic sexism, language that's embedded, that has sexism embedded within it. And this, this is hard to believe it back in the day, 1970s, 1980s, when we were becoming more recognizing the problems with linguistic sexism, more attention was drawn to it. This is like, post-feminist movement. There was moves like changing from chairman to chairperson, fireman to firefighter, policeman to police officer. That was a bumpy road, I can tell you. I mean, going back in time, and that was, people fought that and resisted that. Go back to culture, right? Sometimes culture, when it's changing, there may be some who have invested in certain ways of thinking about culture and don't want it to change. For some people, it's just like, this is just like, for them, it's just, it's change is hard on people sometimes. Sometimes more people are more open to it. But I think linguistic sexism is a good Examination, I'm thinking about, well, language reflects cultural values and ideas. It shapes reality to some extent. So let's pay attention to language and shift the language and maybe ways that are more democratic, more and valuing more individuals, this idea of praxis. Think about, the language crippled was common probably before the 1980s, 1970s. And now it's a person with a disability. Colored people is a language that goes back, I think like 1940s, 1950s, 1930s. People of color is more contemporary, last 10, 15 years, using language of people of color. And sometimes students confuse the two, be writing in papers, write colored people without understanding kind of the origins of that language. So I think it's important for me. I want to indicate that there's a difference there between those two terms. Even think about Latinx, relatively new. Everybody has a gender, everybody has an X chromosome. So Latinx is referring to the male or female. Hispanic, Latino, Latina using the ampersand, Chicano, Chicana using the ampersand. Think about cisgender, gender fluidity, transgender. There's a whole body in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy, mental health related, that the way that we think shapes our behavior. Our thoughts so language is going to be an important part of this. So sometimes it's like changing our language. We talk about this like within educational circles, having an open mindset. Think about what the opportunities, what I can do versus what I can't do. Trying to shift thinking to shift both our emotional state and our behavioral states. It's kind of an application of language. So theme number 3 is like define, explain what the superior whorf hypothesis is, and maybe what it does not, kind of some of the challenges with it or some of the debate about it. There's recently been a move to homelessness, unhoused, or houselessness. So in a few sentences, explain how this relates to some of the content that we're talking about with the language itself. All right, so now we'll move on to social construction of reality. And this is going to be something that comes up, we'll talk about quite a bit throughout the course of the term. Basically, the meaning that we assign things are human constructs. Language is something humans come up with. Constructs, the way of organizing the world, are human creations. They're not actually real, but we can confuse the two sometimes. So if something gets constructed as being real, we construct a reality in a particular way, then it's like that water we swim in, and we don't think about its constructed nature. So it becomes normalized, we get habituated into it. We tend to view the world through constructs. I'll give you an example. Like think about racial constructs, racial categories, gender categories, be another one. Ideas of fairness, right? So how we think about fairness, we construct reality around fairness. And some constructs, many of them, they're relatively stable. Sometimes they become destabilized, but constructs tend to be stable. And they're based on some shared meaning. Not everybody necessarily is in full agreement, but across, a nation of 380 million people, fairly somewhat shared meaning going on, some agreed upon meaning. And sometimes things that are disrupted, things change, right? Moving to Latinx, even within the Latinx community, Hispanic community, not everybody in that community sees that language in the same way. So it's like this constructing reality. So it's constantly going on, I would say. And there are time periods where it's accelerating in terms of deconstructing something to reconstruct it in different ways. Language is a core part in constructing reality. Meanings become institutionalized sometimes, where they become kind of normative, they become expressed through institutions, and they get becoming viewed as being real. Ultimately, the idea is that meaning is arbitrary, but it's very real. So even though it's arbitrary, that's socially constructed, it's real because we built institutional rules and regulations to support a particular constructed reality. We respond to the world based on our construction, so it's very real. So can't say, to say that, with that, that race is a social construct. Yes, it's not built on biology. It's not based on biology. It's not biologically determined. It's not built on biology. It's a social construct, but it's very real at the same time because that's how we've been conditioned to see the world. That's how institutions kind of look at the world. So we don't want to ignore the way that's been constructed and its impact. So that becomes a little bit of the trick. I like this example again. I mean, I can't show these to you just because they're copyright protected. But I love looking at fonts, super interesting fonts, that we associate meaning And sometimes we'll even see, we can look at a particular, like that's Suzuki. I know that's Suzuki. Of course, that's Pepsi, Facebook. Was that Libby? I think that's Wilson, Hyatt, Amazon. I don't know what that one is. Of course, that one's Amazon too. Google, Monster drink, Tesla, Skype, IBM. Yeah, it's like, wow, it's pretty interesting, right? We've constructed fonts to construct association and meaning. Marketing and advertising is sort of rich with thinking about this kind of stuff. We can kind of get into the political domain, the political realm. We could get into all kinds of stuff about race and class intersecting with social constructions of stuff. The political nature of social construction, who benefits from particular constructions, who has the greater voice in constructing reality, like all these different kind of things we can kind of get into. So we have a long history in terms of creating panics around alcohol and drug related issues. We're the only nation that, I guess I don't make that claim without, we're either the only or one of the few who had prohibition, law prohibiting alcohol. I know there's other countries around the world that don't, that there's prohibitions against alcohol. I'm thinking from the Western world perspective that, we see it as a moral kind of crisis kind of thing. So if you look at time period of prohibition, there was sort of focus on linkage between drinking, alcohol use and crime, alcohol use and poverty, and this really strong kind of connection going on. And there was this sort of middle class moral positioning going on, the temperance movement and leaders. And there's a lot of background and context, like the social and cultural context around that, but it's like, constructing an idea about the evils of alcohol and then led to criminalization. So this is the importance of understanding constructions, is that if we construct a meaning in a particular way, it has particular consequences. Sometimes those consequences are particular to groups as well. So like race and class may matter. I like to think about the language that we are, I believe this is probably true, that we are the only nation that declares a war on social problems, like a war on crime, a war on crack, a war on meth, a war on drugs. We don't talk about managing social problems, which is a much more reasonable approach, like a public health model. So if I go back to cultural values, that first chart way back here, I think I could think, oh yeah, you can use some of our cultural value and cultural variability. Not the only explanation, but one of the explanations for why certain countries go to certain places that they do. We think about alcohol and drug related things. Marijuana, really fascinating history. 1937, Anslinger forms the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. It's the first time there's an organization to actually fight against sort of marijuana. He's what we call a moral entrepreneur. He's trying to build a business, and he's building the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So he's using a lot of just sort of hyperbolic, like these cases and examples, creating fear. It's like this mobilization, it's killing our youth. People become killers, wild orgies, wild parties. It's like throwing fear into Americans. And then we start, our first drug war. It's also intersecting with Mexican Americans. And there's a racial dimension to the marijuana menace back in the 1930s as well. Here's some comments that kind of really from Anslinger that could identify there's fear about there's a migration of African Americans moving out of the South during the war industries in World War I, and then following World War I, and more interaction between African Americans and whites. They have different music and different culture. Things are going on. Things are dynamic, and it's a time period where Anslinger starts to identify marijuana as being the sort of major problem that's going to destroy kind of the fabric of America. And people believe it. Think about the Red Scare in the 1950s, right? Sort of the Red Scare. And we can get right in there where the collective we, not necessarily everyone, but it becomes the dominant viewpoint and perspective. And it's like, well, I think we should be more careful in how we construct reality to make sure we're constructing in ways that make sense and that are doing things that serve the interest of the majority of people. I think the crack scare of the 1980s was really powerful. 1980s, 1990s, there was an idea that this is both Republicans and Democrats were engaging in the war on drugs. I think it's probably Clinton, a Democrat, who probably escalated the war on drugs further than Republicans did. And it was political positioning. And there's a lot of fear going on in communities, and there were individuals, politicians who were helping to create that fear. The idea that there were super predators, that youth in inner cities were basically born to be predators. The racism built in that language is incredibly powerful, constructing that particular idea about America's youth. For me, very disturbing. And again, like during that time period, I lived that time period, that idea of super predator, most people didn't become more critically reflective of that language, but thought that was sort of the truth. And we wouldn't even use that, terminology today, which tells you something about social construction, right? So this is like the war on drugs started in the most contemporary version of the war on drugs. Look at it, our incarcerated population. I mentioned last week that America, we incarcerate, so we have 6% of the overall global population, world population, but we incarcerate, of all the individuals incarcerated in the world, America houses 25% of them. So we incarcerate a lot of people. Ideal culture, practice culture starts kind of thinking of, oops, get rid of that. Ideas of fairness in the law. Powder cocaine during the war on drugs. Powder cocaine got 500 grams of powder cocaine gave you the same sentence as 5 grams of crack cocaine. So big racial disparity that became eventually viewed as being unconstitutional. Ideal culture, practice culture. Think about the most dangerous drug. Kind of go down the list. And it's like you wonder, there's been a move recently in Oregon, Colorado, other places, psilocybin used for, or mushrooms used for therapeutic reasons. If you look at the lethality of them are relatively low compared to other things. So what are we addressing when we're looking at alcohol and drugs, and how do we address it is really a story about culture. It's a story about narratives and stories. It's a story of constructed reality, of language. So many different things that we've been talking about kind of relate to that. We look at, razors, looking at women and females and shaving, whether to shave or not to shave. January, sort of a recognized month in January to stop shaving. Sort of the declaration of autonomy and independence and freedom, of redefining sort of the female body. Think about, products, go back to civilizing process. If I can go back to that from way earlier, where was that? Like right here, right? Norbert Elias started wondering, okay, so presentation of our body, shaving legs, parts of our body and how we present them. There's sort of something goes on within culture at some point in time where having body hair gets viewed through a different lens. So theme number 4. So watch that video, Prickly Subject, Aeon Magazine. You can type that in to a search engine. It's a 4-minute video. So using the language of the social construction of reality, so basically define social construction of reality, or bring that into your discussion of this short video, and make a connection between social construction of reality and body hair. All right, and then the last one of getting theories of the self. And this is going to get a little bit tricky, but we'll kind of keep it general, and then in class maybe kind of pull it apart a little bit more. So it's like, how do we develop the self? Cooley has the idea of the looking glass self. Mead has the idea that self develops through a series of stages where we take the role of other. So Cooley, looking glass self. Mead, by taking the role of other, we start to develop a sense of who we are. And Goffman has this idea that we develop a sense of who we are through performance. Okay, so we can kind of break these down in some sort of way. Maybe I'll use like what do we see in terms of masculinity? How do boys develop ideas of masculinity? What's right and what is wrong? A lot of social influences going on, right? Part of it is looking glass self, thinking about how others might see oneself is starting to shape oneself. Mead's idea, taking the role of other, basically understanding how a particular individual or society itself looks at oneself. Or Goffman about performance. And that's how people develop a sense of, or boys develop a sense of masculinity, is through actually performance. We can look at our body and our body size, body image, and this becomes like looking glass self component. Also like this idea that we're developing ideas of society and culture from a Mead perspective, or dramaturgical kind of elements kind of there. So I don't know, this is a chart that maybe help out a little bit. So the self is like formed through language and thought connection. Through our interactions, we develop new ways of thinking, knowing, and shapes our thought, and then it shapes kind of our identity and who we become. Self is a social product. So, I mean, self emerges in a social context. Cooley made a statement one time that society and the self are twin born. If you look at feral children as an example, children who grow up without any human connection or limited human connection, they have there's long-term developmental implications of that, where they don't develop a sense of self like we think about it. And society and connecting to others is an important part for self-development. So Mead, well, let's start with Cooley. So imagine how we look to others. So think about our body size and our body shape, right? Imagine how we look to others. Then we evaluate that. So imagine how that person or individual see me in terms of my body. I evaluate, put a value judgment on it. Do they see this, good, bad? Like, how do they think about that? So, and then I develop, a self based on my perceptions of how other people view me. Now, there's some flaws in this, right? Perceptions may be inaccurate. People may overinflate or underinflate other people's judgments. Sometimes we're our own kind of worst critics, where our critic voice comes through, where other people don't see us in a way, but we're imagining they see us a particular way. So sometimes we have to check with ourselves to make sure that we're not putting undue, the wrong evaluation judgment from others. So Cooley has this idea of like forming a sense of our body, and our body image comes from that sort of imagining how others see us and the judgment that we give that. Mead has this idea that we have two different parts of ourselves. We have the I and the me. The I is the unsocial, the more impulsive sense of who we are. The me is more when people take the role of other. You think about the I when there's not an audience around, when people are not actively involved in thinking about how other people see them, or they're not attending to, or they're not focused on and aware of other people's reactions to their behavior. The me, when they are, so that's the I when they're not that. The me is more reflective. It's a reflective self. We won't go through the stages of development, but basically kind of want to end up here though, the last stage. At some point in a kid's development, they start to develop an idea of society, and that's the generalized other. So larger groups in society is the generalized other. For Mead, it's about taking the role of other. So people take the role of specific other before they make a decision about, for Mead, people think before they act. And when they think, they're thinking about when they take the role of others. So thinking about significant others, when they're really young, significant others, their mother, their father, teacher, people they're really closely connected to, that's the specific other. So they're wondering, how does the specific other, how does mom, how does dad, how do people in my immediate environment, how do they think about, action A, B, or C? And that starts to shape our behavior. Eventually people develop a generalized other, the expectations of society. So so it becomes a sort of, that's how society at large has an influence on who we are. Thomas theorem, if you define it's real and its consequences. It's not really, for me, a part of like this theories of the development of self, but it's an important sociological concept related to like the social construction of reality, right? So if we define it in a way, we respond to it if it were true that way. And then Goffman has the idea that basically everything's a theatrical performance. Gender is performed. Gender is something that we embody. Gender is something that we do. We actually do gender. Our body size or our body position, how we stand, man spreading, how we walk, how we dress, how we appear. That's both how we present our presentation of self, but it's also how we become in terms of a gendered self. And for Goffman, it's about managing impressions. We're all managing impressions. So impression management is something that's important that humans do. And we do it based on there's the interrelationship between the actor and the audience. The audience changes, the actor changes, it may change their performance. The stage, the setting, the props, the clothes, the costume, the script, and go back to gender, masculinity and femininity. There's a script. There's a script in terms of behavior, of talking, patterns of talk, patterns of speech. Women's voices overall, this has been noted over the last decade, that women's voices around the world in a lot of countries are actually getting lower in tonal quality. They're dropping in pitch. Well, Is that conscious? I don't know. It depends on how we think about conscious. But I think, this idea that women are recognized, they move more and more into leadership positions. A lower voice signals a greater sense of authority. Part of playing the role of someone in an authority position is to speak in a lower tone voice. So it's like, that's dramaturgical, very much in nature. And that's how you start to become that role, so to speak. Okay, so here's Cooley's idea. I'm not what I think I am. I am not what you think I am. I am what I think you think I am. So that's that perception and judgment there, right? So our body size is shape, color, like how do we think, how do we develop our racial self? We all have racial identities. The majority group, minority groups, everybody has a racial identity. So how do we form racial identity, gender identity, parts of who we are? These two cute kids here playing medical, something in the medical field, playing doctors. Straight white teeth, go back to that. There's a lot of impression management stuff there. Applications of dramaturgy, white nationalism. I think there's a lot of dramaturgical elements going on, maybe Antifa as well. Well, for sure, dramaturgical elements. Going to stores, corporatization of sort of dramaturgical elements in terms of presentation of self as an employee. The doctor's office, the setting, what's in the doctor's office, how's it laid out? The first date is ripe with sort of dramaturgical kind of elements. All right, so the last prompt here. So select two theories, and there's some pretty cool short videos if you're interested. You can look up Mead, Goffman, development self, and you find some good. Khan Academy has a good one too. But you can kind of look at some of those, and just based on the discussion in this lecture, take two of those theories, provide a few sentences, describe that theory, how that theory relates to one of the following: our gender identity, the ways we think on a job or act on a job interview, the ways we might act on a first day of on the job or something, or any example of your choosing. So basically just explain the theory and how it applies. All right, that's a lot of content for today. Look forward to our class discussion. Be safe, be well, enjoy yourself, and see you in class.